Hey there! So last time I showed you how this nice CI/CD process for ADF using ADF Tools can look like. What benefits it gives us. For example, this wonderful possibility of doing our deployments selectively. And today I would like to show you how to set it up from scratch. So let's get started. Alright, so setting up ADF CI/CD pipelines using ADF Tools. So first let me show you my environment that I will be working on. So as previously, I have two instances of my Azure Data Factory. The first one called Dev Data Factory Table, that's the development instance. And the other one that is called Prod Data Factory Table, that's our production instance. And I will be working on these two. And these are the same instances that I used previously. So we already have some objects deployed to them. When it comes to pipelines, I have nothing. I removed everything we had previously, so we will have a clean environment. Well, more or less clean, because some objects that are reused between different types of deployments, I didn't remove, and I will show them to you in a second. Alright, so how to get started? Well, I have a GitHub repository, this dp23 repo, inside which I store various resources for every episode. And for this episode 25, I have this nice README file that describes exact steps that will help you to set it up. So let's simply follow this guide. And by the way, this guide was prepared with me in mind. So it describes the process that works in my case. But feel free to adjust it, to modify it however you want, just to make it useful for your business cases. Alright, so the first step the guide tells us to do is to turn on Git integration on our dev instance. And we should already have it configured because we've been using those ADF instances so far, but let's double check this. So to check or to configure Git integration for ADF, you will have to go to the Manage tab and then to the Git configuration. So first here and then here. And we can see that yes, indeed, my developer instance of Data Factory has a Git repository configured. So we don't have to do it anymore. On the other hand, my production environment, my production instance of Data Factory, it shouldn't have this configured. Let's double check this. And yes, it is empty. And that's how it should be done. We don't want to configure Git integration on prod, only on dev. Alright, so the next step the guide tells us to do is to switch to Azure DevOps and create a folder called DevOps Generic, and inside this folder create this ADF Selective Job Template YAML file with some contents. And in a second I will describe what this file does. But first, let's just create it. Alright, so let me jump into repository of my Data Factory project, and I will do everything via a browser because it's simpler and faster to do. Usually I would do this through a Visual Studio Code or some other text editor, but for now, let's stick to a web browser. And there is one more thing I did in the meantime. Basically, I disabled branch policies on my main branch, the one that I'm working on right now. So I will be able to make my commits, my changes directly to this branch, just to configure the CI/CD stuff faster without having to go through pull requests. In real life, you want to have this configured, and at the end, we will set it up. Alright, so actually let me remove this directory because it's some kind of a leftover. So what we have is in my repository that we have this Data Factory folder that contains the code of my Data Factory. And secondly, we've got this DevOps directory that right now contains those files that were used in case of ARM-based deployment. But we can ignore them. We'll just add new stuff. And according to the guide, we want to create this file. So let me copy a name under DevOps/generic folder. So let's do this. Add new file under DevOps generic and the file name like so, without the space at the end. Alright, and let me copy the content of the file and let's commit it. Alright, but what this file does? Well, that's the main file, main template that will be used to deploy our stuff using ADF Tools. So basically, it expects various parameters and then it performs a deployment job. And it has several steps inside. So first of all, it gets a code associated with given pipeline run. So it gets it from the repository. Then it installs those ADF Tools PowerShell modules that are required to run. And by the way, if you're wondering how I knew what commands have to be run, well, that's simple. Simply, if you go to Azure Data Factory Tools repository on GitHub, and I will give you a link in the video description, then you will find a pretty good documentation about it. And one of the first information you will find here is how to start. And yes, here you can see exactly what PowerShell commands you would have to use to install and to import those PowerShell modules. And that's exactly what our ADF selective template job YAML file does. Alright, so once those modules are installed, I execute this test ADF code function that basically tests the integrity of our data factory. And this function is also quite well described in the documentation. So if you are curious what it does exactly under the hood, just take a look there. And finally, the most important part of the whole script is this. Deploy Azure Data Factory using a PowerShell, and here simply I am executing a deployment script that is provided by a path to this template YAML file. I know it might sound complicated right now, but in a second you will see that it's actually pretty easy to use. Alright, so let's move on. So we've got this selective deploy job file, great. And then what the guide wants us to do is to create configuration files. And again, there are multiple ways we can configure ADF Tools to work or to deploy various properties on different environments. The approach I use here is to use dedicated CSV configuration files, each for every environment. So I'll have a dev CSV and prod CSV files. So I will create this dev CSV file under DevOps config directory, and then I will fill it with some dummy content. So the path of DevOps config. So let me create a new file, DevOps config, and let's call it dev CSV. And now let me copy the contents of the file. Let me commit it, and that's it. Alright, but how does this config file look like? So, well, it's simply a CSV file that has 4 columns: type, name, path, and value. And by the way, this is really well described in the documentation. So in case of any doubts, just refer to documentation. But I will quickly go over it, how it works. So basically, when using ADF Tools, we can configure pretty much everything we want in a super easy way. And those config files are used just for this purpose. So if you take a look at how your data is organized into Data Factory, how your code is organized, you will see those top-level folders like dataset, factory, linked service, pipeline, and so on, depending on what kind of objects you have. And this first column, called type, it simply maps to this top-level directory. It indicates what kind of object, what type of object we want to parameterize. And in my case, I want to configure a linked service to data lake. Because let me show you what linked service I'm talking about. So we've got this ADLS Gen2 linked service that on dev environment, it points to this table data lake demo something data lake. Obviously, on prod environment, it has to point to a different data lake. So this property, this URL, has to be parameterized. It has to be dynamic. It has to be different on dev and prod instances. Fortunately, it's super easy to configure it. So let's get back to our CSV configuration file. So we know already that if I want to configure a linked service, then the first value in my CSV file has to be called linked service, because our linked services are stored in this linked service directory, the code for them. Great. Then, oh come on, where is this CSV file? Then the second column we have is called name. And simply, that's the name of the file we want to configure. And in our case, it is this file name, because it contains a code of my linked service. So that's exactly it. Right? Super simple so far. Then we have to indicate what property inside given object, in my case inside this particular linked service, we want to parameterize. So let's take a look at the structure of this linked service. And you can see that it is a JSON file that we should recognize already. And what I did here was to use type properties.url syntax. And what does it mean? Well, by default, ADF Tools will start traversing for the hierarchy of our JSON file, starting from the properties object. And from it, we can reference whatever we want. And in my case, this URL is here. So to go to it, I have to indicate that, alright, it is under type properties, which is under properties, which are default start of our configuration path. And then we've got this URL element. So that's why I use this type properties.url value as the thing to be configured here, as the path, because that's the third thing we have to configure. And finally is the value. So basically, what should be the value of this particular property on a given environment? And in my case, it is a path to this table data lake demo storage account. As simple as that. Really, it couldn't be done easier. And in my case, what I did was to use a common configuration files for all teams. So no matter how many teams will be reusing this single data factory, I will have only a single configuration file per each environment. Why? Because some of the properties will be shared by multiple teams, like this linked service. And I want to have it configured in a single place. Now, to allow different teams to configure their own properties however they want, what I did was to create various sections for various teams. And here they would be able to configure their stuff however they want. So let's say that I'm a member of Team 1 and I would like to configure something just to show that it really works. And you should remember that Team 1 objects are stored under this Team 1 directory. And let's say that I want to, what do I want to configure? Yeah. Alright, so we've got this wait activity under Team 1 pipeline, and I want to parameterize this description field. For some reason, I want to have a different value on dev and prod environments. Alright, great. So how to do this? Well, again, super simple. We've got to indicate that, first of all, it is a pipeline object that I want to configure. Then I have to indicate what file name or what pipeline I want to configure. This Team1 pipeline, that's the one. And please note that here in code repository, you won't see this folder structure that exists in the UI. I mean, those directories like Team1, Team2, and so on. They don't exist in the code repository. In a repo, everything is flat. So we've got all pipelines at the same level. But if you take a look at the content and at the code of any of those pipelines, you will see this logical folder that instructs you, the ADF, how to display them on the UI. And basically, that's the code of our pipeline that you want to parameterize. Alright. And the feature that we want to parameterize was description, which is here. But it might be problematic because, first of all, we can see that it is under activities. It is the first activity out there. We've got to wait activities. And those activities, well, we have to somehow reference them. Fortunately, as you can see, it is a table, so we can use indexes. And then you can see that we've got this description field that we want to parameterize. So translating this into our configuration, it would mean that actually we would use this activities 0 to indicate that, hey, that's the first activity out of many that this pipeline might contain, and you want to parameterize this description field. Alright, but what this $sign does? Well, that's a pretty nice thing that Kamil did, the creator of ADF Tools. So basically, sometimes you don't want to start from the properties element. Sometimes you would like to go from the root of the file. And in this case, you can use this $sign and then traverse the hierarchy from it. It is not necessary in this case, but I just wanted to highlight this possibility. Alright, so basically, this configuration part will tell ADF Tools that we want to set this dev description of this wait activity on dev to this particular value. Alright, so that's super simple. Alright, what the guide tells us to do next is to create something similar files for remaining environments like UAT and prod. So actually, let's do this. So let me copy the content and let me create a new file called prod. CSV. And let me paste the stuff. And actually, what do I have to change here are those two values that would match our prod environment. So in the case of description, I will just make it like this, production environment. And for the linked service, let me simply go to my prod environment. And let's take a look at what value should be stored here. It's prod data lake table value. So super simple. Alright, so let me change it, commit, and we are done. So configuration for prod environment is ready. Alright, great. And then, according to the guide, we've got to create service connections. Fortunately, we already have those service connections. And just to remind you, service connection is an identity that we'll use to connect from Azure DevOps pipelines to your Azure environment. So basically, when we'll be deploying various objects, we'll have to be allowed to do this. We have to have some permissions, like contributor role. And those service connections allow us to do this. But if we take a look at project settings, and somewhere here we should see service connections, you will see that we already have those two CI/CD dev and CI/CD prod service connections created. Because I created them at the time when we were setting up the ARM-based version of those CI/CD pipelines. So there's no point of removing them and recreating them from scratch. If you would like to see how I did this, you will have to go and watch one of those previous episodes. Alright, the same with environments. We already have those environments created. I mean dev and prod. They can be reused. And let me verify that indeed we have two environments. Yep, we've got dev and prod. We created them previously. And what's more is that on prod environment, we should have this approval required. So the pipeline would have to receive an approval to be able to deploy its stuff on this environment. And the approval has to be given by me. So again, this is already done. So cool, let's move forward. Then, optionally, we could use variable groups. And actually here, I would say that the possibility of storing our stuff inside those CSV configuration files is super cool. So actually, we don't need that much those variable groups. And just to show you, those variable groups are here under library, and we've got two, dev and prod, and we use them in case of those ARM-based templates. We can still use them when using ADF Tools. So for example, inside our CSV files, instead of hard coding a value here, you could reference our value from a library. That would be completely fine, but it might be an overkill. It's up to you to decide how you want to have it done. In my case, I will leave them aside. Alright, so let's move forward. Now, let's start creating a pipeline or stuff required for CI/CD to deploy everything. And you should remember that in my case, actually, let me draw it just to refresh your memory. All right. So let me switch to whiteboard. So what we have? So in our very simple CI/CD pipeline flow, so that's our main branch, it looks like this. So developer creates a pull request from the main branch, creates some commits, tests the changes, and so on, creates a pull request to the main branch. It then triggers the automatic CI/CD stuff that deploys everything to dev environment, and then it stops. And the objects that I will create right now will be used just for this purpose, to deploy everything that is in the main branch automatically to our dev ADF live environment. So let's move on. So let me create this file called deploy script ps1 under scope everything. So let's go back to my DevOps and let's create a new file. Scope everything and this deploy script ps1 file. And let me copy it. Like so. And basically, that's the actual PowerShell script that will deploy our data factory. It will be called from the generic template. From this one, we'll provide a path to our file, so it will be called like this. And here you will see this publish ADF v2 from JSON file. That's the main function from ADF Tools that actually does the actual deployment. Of course, we'll provide various parameters to make it configurable. Alright, so that's it. And then inside this the same file, DevOps scope everything, let's create this pipeline YAML file that will contain a definition of our CI/CD pipeline. So let me create a new file called pipeline YAML, like so. And let me copy it and let's paste the content. Alright, so we have the file created. And what we'll have to do right now is to replace all those placeholders like this with actual values. So let's do this. Alright, so what do we have here? Well, stage name. Well, it's pretty easy. In my case, I want to have a stage be called the same name as the target environment. So in my case, it will be simply dev, like so. Then a variable group. So we have those variable groups. I'm not going to make use of them, but just to show you how to reference them, I will configure this. Then the path to our selective template job, it is fine, provided that we are following the guide, because it is stored here under generic, so it should be fine. Then the name of our environment, it should be either dev or prod, and in our case it is simply called dev. Then the name of our data factory, so let me copy it. It is like this. Then, of course, without the space. Then location, I know it is West Europe. Then the resource group name is DP203. Config path is like dev CSV. Service connection name, I think it was dev CI/CD something, right? But let's double check this. Yeah, CI/CD dev. So it's CI/CD dev, and that's it. So that should be fine. So we configured our YAML file to match our dev environment. Alright, the next thing we've got to do is to create the actual pipeline inside the DevOps and indicate our pipeline YAML file as its source. Alright, so let's go into pipelines. Let's create a brand new one. We know that its source is in the Azure repos, so let's use this option. It's in my ADF CI demo repository. I already have a YAML file that contains a definition of my pipeline, so let's use this option. And now I've got to provide a path to this pipeline file, and that's the part that I don't really like. So let me just do it like this. It should be something like this, I believe. Like DevOps, scope, everything, pipeline, YAML. So DevOps, scope, everything, pipeline, YAML. It should be fine. So let's create it. Let's save our pipeline. And actually, let's rename it like whole ADF. Alright, so let's run it and let's verify whether it will run successfully. So the pipeline has been queued because that's the first time I'm executing this pipeline. It needs some permissions. So first of all, it has to be given a permission to use this dev variable group. So let's allow for this. It needs the permission to use the CI/CD dev service connection. That's fine. And it needs a permission to use our dev environment. And again, that's fine. And these were one-time actions. Once we've given the consent, from now on, it should happen automatically. And once it is happening, let me go back to the pipeline just to explain you what it does. So first of all, this pipeline, it triggers on any change in the main branch. So if we take a look at our flow, whatever happens in our main branch, it will automatically trigger this particular CI/CD pipeline. Then it has only a single stage called dev that has a single job, which definition is stored in the selective job template file, this one that we've just created, and we are passing various parameters to it. The most important ones are two. The first one, what is the configuration file we want to use, and secondly, where is the PowerShell script that we want to execute that will actually do the deployment. And actually take a look that it already finished. So we can see all those steps, like get the code repository, then install all those PowerShell modules that are required, then test the code of my data factory. Fortunately, there are no errors. And the most important thing is this deploy Azure Data Factory step. And in my case, because its job was to deploy everything, it deployed all 9 out of 9 objects. So that's fine, because that's what we want to do in this case. Alright, great. So we are halfway through the whole configuration process. So now we've got to create those selective pipelines. And those selective pipelines, they will be used by different teams. So in my case, I will create a selective pipeline for team 1 or for product 1. So let's create a new deploy PS1 file under scope product 1 or team 1, whatever structure works in your case. So again, let me create a new file, product 1, deploy PS1. So you can see already that we'll have as many scopes as many teams will have. We'll just need to create as many selective pipelines as you really want. Alright, and then inside this deploy script, you've got to paste the content from the guide. And this time it is a bit more complicated, because here we want our pipeline to be selective. Previously, it deployed everything. It used quite a lot of default options. And if you take a look at ADF Tools, you'll see that it has quite a lot of options you can use. Like, we can define what objects are to be included or excluded, and that's how those selective deployments are made possible. Then we can use this flag to indicate whether the objects that are not in the source code should be removed from the target environment or not. Then we can define what to do with triggers. Do we want to start and stop them or not? We can indicate if we want to create a new instance of Data Factory if it doesn't exist. Or we can decide, do we want to deploy global parameters? And so on and so on. So there are quite a lot of options. So please make sure to go through this list and make sure to understand them, what they do and how they behave and how they impact the deployment result. Alright, in my case, what I tried to do was to make those PowerShell scripts as flexible and reusable as possible, which means that basically I have only this part that needs to be customized by various teams, because that's the place where various teams would define what objects they want to be deployed. And first of all, what I'm using is this getObjectsByFolderName function, which will result all objects that are stored in a particular directory. So let's take a look at our data factory. So you can see that our pipelines and our datasets are organized by directories. Directories by teams, by products. So if you follow this pattern, and if you put all pipelines belonging to a team 1 inside a team 1 directory, then inside your selective pipeline, you can say, hey, I want to deploy everything that is stored inside this team 1 directory. So later on, if you add new pipelines, they will be automatically added to the list and then deployed. So you wouldn't have to explicitly maintain this list. It also applies to datasets. So if you use the same folder name, like team1 here and here, then by using a single command, you can grab all datasets and all pipelines that are stored inside these directories. So it's super easy, super simple, and it makes deployment just easier. So that's my advice. Organize your objects inside Data Factory. If you have multiple teams, then split it like this. And by the way, using this function is not the only way we could use to filter the objects you want to retrieve. No, there are other objects as well described in documentation. For example, we could use wildcards. So we could grab objects that begin with a specific phrase, which is again super useful. So then, apart from those objects that are stored inside team1 directory, I want to explicitly include some linked services, integration runtime, and data factory in itself. And the syntax is super easy. Again, in case of linked services, I've got to indicate I want to use linked service and then provide a name. In case of integration runtime, again, everything from the integration runtime directory, if it was here, and the dot says, well, every object. So for example, if we have managed VNets, manage private endpoints, they would be included. And finally, I have this factory object which translates to this directory. And that's it. So every new team that would like to follow would have to just configure this stuff and optionally set various flags. So maybe you would like to have this delete not in source flag enabled. So in case you no longer have some objects, you would like it to be removed from the target environment. Alright, so we have this PSV file. Then we've got to create a deployment pipeline that in this case will be longer than previously. Actually, let me commit the PowerShell file. And let's add this pipeline YAML file. In this case, this pipeline definition is longer because we'll have two stages here. One that deploys to dev environment and one that deploys to prod environment. And take a note that in this case, there is no trigger. We don't want this pipeline to be started automatically. No, we want it to be started manually by a human whenever this person believes that it is the time to deploy his stuff to given environment. Alright, and again, we would have to fill all those fields basically in the same way as previously, and just to save on time, I will copy a version that already has all those things set up. Hopefully it will work just fine. So let me commit it. Alright, and finally we've got to create a new pipeline for team 1 in this case, and let's indicate that this YAML file should be used as its definition. So let's go to pipelines and let's add a new one. And by the way, you can see that this pipeline that deploys everything, it started. Why? Because we've just created a new commit, a new change into the main branch by adding those additional files. But let's create a pipeline for this team 1. And again, we know that the code is stored in Azure repos. We already have the code in the YAML file, and it should be like this. Product 1, I don't remember. Yep, it's like this. So let's save it. Let's rename it to team 1, like so. And let's take a look at our pipelines. So we should have 2 at this moment. Oh, come on. I made a mistake and accidentally I added this pipeline under a directory. So instead of renaming a pipeline, I created a directory. So let's fix this, like so. Let me refresh the screen. Let's delete this folder because we don't need it anymore. Oh, come on, like so. Alright, so we have 2 pipelines. The whole ADF that starts automatically and it deploys everything that is deployed in the main branch, and it just deploys it to dev environment only. And apart from that, we've got this team 1 selective deployments that is triggered manually by a human, but it deploys only objects that we explicitly indicated to be deployed, which were mainly those under team 1 directory with some additional ones, and it deploys it to dev and prod environments. So actually, let's run it. And again, because that's the first time we are running this pipeline, it needs the same kind of approvals as the previous pipeline. So let's grant it. And let's wait a second for it to be finished. Alright, so the dev stage has finished. Right, so the dev stage has been completed. It's waiting for our approval to deploy to prod. But let's take a look what it did in the case of dev environment. And I will focus on this deploy step. And if we scroll down, we can see that actually it deployed only 5 out of 9 objects. So it ignored all those objects that we didn't explicitly define. And that's super cool, because this way we can deploy only our stuff. We can forget about the other teams that are doing something on the same instance, and we can deploy only the stuff that is important to us. So let's approve deployment to prod. There will be one more approval pending, because this prod environment is protected. So let's give an approval. And in the meantime, let's quickly take a look at our stuff deployed on prod. So we have right now only stuff from the team 1. And in case of this first activity that we want to parameterize, it has this description for prod environment. And if everything works fine, in a second we should see here description for production environment, because that's how we configured it in the prod CSV configuration file. So let's take a look how it goes. Alright, so the deployment is in progress. It finished. It deployed 5 objects out of 9, so that's fine. Let me refresh my production data factory. And yep, we can see that the description changed. We have description for production environment this time. And still, there is nothing from the second team deployed on prod, even though we have those objects available in our repository. But they were simply ignored, because it's not our task as members of Team 1 to deploy those objects. And that's how easy it is to set up those selective CI/CD pipelines for Azure Data Factory using ADF Tools. Alright, so to summarize, you should be aware now how easy it is to configure CI/CD pipeline for Data Factory, whether you use ARM-based approach, which deploys everything in one go, and there is no option to be selective, or if that approach doesn't work for you, you can use those ADF tools created by Kamil Nowinski, Microsoft MVP, that has a lot of cool features, including this selective deployment. But please be aware that it's not the only benefit of using ADF tools. It has a lot of more cool stuff that I encourage you to go through documentation to learn about. And by the way, if you like ADF tools, if you use them, then reach out to Kamil and just say thanks for your work in maintaining this solution. It helps me in my daily work. It will motivate him to keep updating and maintaining this solution. But anyway, CI/CD stuff for Data Factory is not that complicated, and it is really something mandatory nowadays. You don't want to have to deploy your stuff manually. No. So choose either version, ARM-based version or ADF tools, or maybe some other approach that you developed in-house, or to find someone somewhere in the internet, but do it automatically. And basically that's it about Data Factory. Starting from the next episode, we'll take a look at some other services. So thanks for watching and take care.